hope this video finds you doing well. As you may know, on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, we have been sending out these little devotional videos for you to watch so we can stay connected to one another, even though we're under this stay-at-home order right now because of the coronavirus. But on Thursdays, we've been talking about the fruit of the Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit, you can find Paul talking about this in his letter to the Galatians. If you look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23, and you may want to turn there right now, pause this video, and just read those two brief verses. But we're talking about joy, and one passage, I'm going to reference a few different passages, but one passage I want you to think about right at the beginning is just one verse from Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, where Paul wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord." You were made for joy. We were made for joy. There's a story that I like to tell about 20 years ago when I bought a chocolate lab, greatest dog I've ever had. And that dog, when she was a puppy, I had to take her to the water several times before she ever got in. But, labs were bred to swim straight down to their webbed feet and paws, and they were made to retrieve in the water. And so when she finally got into the water, it was so amazing to see the joy that brought her, that she was made for the water, to discover that's what she was made for. And you were made for joy. You were made for deep fulfillment. You were made for happiness, for complete satisfaction. And you were made to live out of that joy, for everything in your life to flow out of that joy. So really, I just want to talk about two things today, which is I want to talk about the danger of looking for joy in our circumstances, and then I want to talk about finding joy in the Lord. So looking for joy in our circumstances. There's an interesting passage in Leviticus chapter 23. And in Leviticus chapter 23, it tells us about the Feast of Tabernacles, or it's often called the Feast of Booths. And so what this was that at the end of the harvest, this was an agrarian people. At the end of the harvest, there would be a celebration, and God had increased his people's wealth significantly. He had added to their material possessions. He had given them gifts. He had made them successful. And so now the harvest had come in, and it was time to celebrate. And so you get the Feast of Booths. But it was a really strange celebration. What they were told was to go out into the wilderness, to leave their homes, and go out into the wilderness and build these little shacks, these little lean-to shacks, booths. And they were to live in these little booths for 12 days. So think about that. The harvest is in, and God says, okay, now I want you to leave all of your comforts, all of your wealth, all of your material possessions and goods, and go live in the most primitive conditions possible. And what were they supposed to do for those 7 days? For 7 days, they were told, Leviticus 23, verse 40, rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. God was saying to them, it's so tempting to look for joy in circumstances, to rejoice in the gift and not the giver of those gifts. And so he's saying to his people, I want to give you a more solid foundation for joy, because circumstances come and go. They're fragile. Don't put your joy in them, because it will fade far too quickly. You are made for a deeper joy than that. There's a story in Luke chapter 10 where Jesus sent his disciples out on basically short-term mission trips, 2 by 2. And so they went and they did these little short-term mission trips, and they came back to Jesus, And it says in Luke chapter 2 that when they came back with joy, saying, Lord, the demons are subject to us in your name. And Jesus told them, nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. See, even spiritually, we see this, that there is a temptation to rejoice in our successes spiritually, to rejoice in our morality, or rejoice in doing good, to rejoice in being right about things. And Jesus is saying that is far too fragile for you to place your joy in. You are meant for real joy, for deep, abiding, and lasting joy. So there's something we need to be careful about, looking for joy in our circumstances, whether that's material possessions or even spiritually. But the second thing I want to talk about is finding joy in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always. Why? Well, think about this, because if your source of joy is the unchanging, unmovable, unshakable, and forever God, then so is your joy. Your joy can't be shaken. Your joy can't be moved. Your joy will last forever if it's placed in the unchanging, unmovable, unshakable, and forever God. But why did Paul write that in Philippians chapter 4? Because he's writing a letter, and if you follow the flow of the letter, here's what happens in Philippians chapter 4. There were two women in the church at Philippi who weren't getting along. You know, it was probably women who were trying to prove to one another, I'm right about this and you're wrong about this. And Paul said, wait, stop. And you know what he actually said in that passage? This comes right before Philippians chapter 4 in verse 3. Chapter 4, verse 4, in verse 3 of chapter 4, where he says to them, stop and remember that your names are written in the book of life. You know, I think he's remembering and he's thinking about that story in Luke chapter 10, and he is saying, you need to stop and remember grace. You didn't get into Jesus' kingdom by being right. And so that should free you to live out of joy and not pettiness, beating each other up and arguing, and instead agree in the Lord, as he says in Philippians chapter 4, which I think is verse 1. But listen, when your joy is in the Lord, your joy then grows in all kinds of situations. Your joy grows in the midst of suffering. Your joy will grow in the midst of trials and hardship and terrible circumstances. So, right, you think about James. He says, consider it joy. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. But he's not the only one to say that. Paul said in Romans, we rejoice in what? We rejoice in our sufferings. Peter wrote, and he said, we rejoice that we participate in the sufferings of Christ. See, all the writers are saying this. If your joy is in the Lord, it grows even in the most unlikely conditions possible, even in the worst of circumstances, in suffering and hardship and trial. Okay, last passage, and then we'll shut it down for today. Jesus' first miracle was at a wedding in Cana. He came to a wedding, and they ran out of wine at the wedding. And you think, okay, you know, they ran out of supplies. No big deal, that happens. Well, in that culture, it was a really big deal. In fact, there's an old rabbinical saying that says, the wine is the joy of the wedding. Right? The wine was a symbol of joy at the wedding, and so to run out of wine was a really, really big deal. It was to say this wedding's not going to be lived out of joy. And so Jesus was there, and we're not going to tell the whole story. There's some great things in that story, but But Jesus turned the water into wine and gave them the best wine possible. Why? Jesus, and it's called the first of his signs. What was it a sign of? Jesus was saying, I came into this world to give you joy, to let you drink the cup of joy, to find the deep happiness and fulfillment and joy you were meant to have. And you were meant to live out of that joy. And here's the thing. You and I are able to sip that cup of joy and drink from that cup of joy and live out of that joy, because what Jesus came into the world to do was to drink the cup of judgment and sorrow for us and in our place. He loved us so much that he came into the world to bear God's judgment for us, so that we could know that now we have no fear of condemnation, that we didn't get into his kingdom by being right, but purely by grace. And now we can live out of joy in him, in the giver of gifts, not in the gifts. And I hope this encourages you today as you think about the fruit of the Spirit. So thank you for being with us, and we'll see you